No, the big anthology that was used in the United States.
This bridge.
Yeah, the bridge.
This bridge called
On the back, and then the sequel to that,
Making Faces.
Making Faces. Yeah, those two anthologies were very powerful. I remember teaching them in the 80s, and they brought out this kind of individual voice of protest. That's so important. That people kind of make fun of now. They say, oh, that's all part of that identity politics. But they were very powerful in their constituting moments. You know.
And we were talking about this in terms of identity politics because, again, in the 90s, what began to happen with identity politics is it turned into one hand, this very moralizing discourse that people used either to shame people or, you're being a racist, or, what you're saying is inappropriate.
Yeah.
Or the government used identity politics, and pointed to people and said, you're hysterical, you're angry. So both, all the constituents in the field around identity politics began to use these terms in very sort of normative ways. But before the term itself became so calcified,
Yeah.
we were talking earlier about what it meant in this period. And in some ways it's interesting because now I see with students, not all students I'm working with, but there tends to be a return to focusing on their own history. It becomes very individualized, and it's the tie to politics is very tenuous, where the very possibilities of this type of work is tied, as you're saying, for example, to constitutional changes, to the organization of aboriginal groups. So there had to be these forms of these spaces where these voices could emerge from.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, the 80s were a time when there was a lot of work around the Constitution, and the Bill of the Canadian Bill of Rights, the Charter of Rights. When was that? 82? In 1983, there was that major all-parliamentary committee report called Equality Now, which actually openly stated that Canada was a racist society. And there were large hearings about it in Canada. And there was also the Multiculturalism Act in 1988. All of that stuff happened in a flurry of activity, but it all died pretty quickly. There was a flurry of activity trying to produce a kind of a more legalized multicultural nation, but then it didn't work. There was so much resistance to it, so much attack on it, so many conflicts in and around it that the government just backed away by 1988. In fact, the Multiculturalism Act was passed in 88, but by 99, the Multiculturalism Department came into being and was gone within a year. There was actually a department, but very few people know that. It was a department that lasted only about a year.
I think we can just go back a bit and talk about more specifically your own work with the redress movement for Japanese Canadians and how your research, but also your writing voice, began to take shape through that activism and the work that you've done.
You want to hear about some of that?
Yeah.
It's pretty boring.
Well,
I was talking with Roland this afternoon. We were talking about activism and scholarship and community work, and I told him that the time period when I worked on redress was a major moment in my life, but it was also the most difficult moment for me, for my academic world, because I was working on all this political work, and at the same time I was an academic. I had to go to university, I had to teach courses, and I was being reviewed, and I was going through a tenure process and all kinds of stuff, and people would say, what are you doing in this public space? You're not doing this academic work. And I had to constantly make excuses for myself. Well, this is really important work. This is, blah, 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 blah. And one of the projects I worked on really seriously at the time, in the little time that I had, was This Is My Own, which was this work on remembering, I guess, in that sense of putting back together Muriel Kitagawa's work. And I spent about 4 years on that, and luckily got a shirt grant for that. Brownie points. I got a shirt grant for that, and everybody said, well, then it must be important. But it took me into the archives, and that was a major revolutionary moment in my life, going into the public archives of Canada and looking at all of the documentation that led to the internment of Japanese Canadians, the RCMP files, the custodians' files, the files of the BC Security Commission, the Department of Labor. It's just this amazing panorama of riches of documents, all of it detailing how Japanese Canadians were stripped of their rights and interned and detained without cause, really. And that was a major turning point for me, and in fact, I totally believe in archival work, and that's one of the things I try to tell my students is don't forget that archives are filled with information about the country and about the nation and about the world that people never think about, because we're so used to just dealing with texts that are already published that we forget about all the texts that never reached the state of public appearance. And we could do a lot of we could learn from historians in that sense of doing archival work.
You've also talked about this, and this has been my experience in the archive as well, is those texts make you understand language in another way. Because I know when I first started doing archival research, because it's like a labyrinth.
Yeah, it's a labyrinth.
And you go in, and just before they had, you had to go to paper indexes, and you'd order something, you'd fill in this long form, and you'd order something, and 3 days later they'd find the box, and the box would arrive. And we'd be waiting there in the library, hoping the box would arrive that day. And it arrived, and then you'd be in the library. You can take it home and look at it, and have coffee and tea. And it was you actually worked on site with these other researchers doing these projects. And actually, my first reaction was I started falling asleep. It wasn't because I was bored, but I found it so overwhelming. So these typewritten texts and the way the ink is imprinted on the paper. And the ink on the side, someone's scribbling on it, going, well, this Jap's got to go, or other written sort of somatic inscriptions on these documents. So even looking at one document, I'd stare at it just for hours and try to experience. And you start thinking about how this document circulated and how it was part of a chain of the family who was trying to ensure that the dying father got to the hospital, and how that letter was part of this chain that the family never was able to see the father before the father died. So it becomes these, you then begin to understand text not as these derealized, words that are on the page you can download from your computer, but you realize how material they are. And then the remains, this is all that remains, because I found another document in the archive around the camps in the Slocan Valley, and the document said, it was from one commissioners to another commissioner, it said, I think we can get rid of about 99% of these documents. So what survived from the camps in the Slocan Valley, we have 1%. So there's all of these other records that have been erased. So you start experiencing erasure. And then, you start noticing all of your material remains that filter through your everyday life as well. So it completely changes your relationship to text and communication, interaction, flows.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I found some amazing documents. I could just mention one that I brought into a poem that was so great. And there are a lot of material for poetry in there, so a lot of my poems steal information from the archive. I figured, what the hell, why should this document go to waste? I can't use it in my book, use it in a poem. And I've done that quite a bit. And the most amazing series of documents, one set was this RCMP file, which was totally devoted to these two guys who cut a hole in the Hastings Park fence, got out, and got in a cab and went and bought a bottle of gin, because they were dying to have a drink. Maybe they wanted to have a cocktail or something like that at night, So they got caught, and the gin was confiscated, and the RCMP wanted to know what they should do with them, not only with the guys, but with the bottle of gin. And there was an incredible series of correspondence that went back and forth from the RCMP office in Ottawa and the RCMP office depot here, debating what they should do. And these guys wanted to charge them with a crime, and the RCMP in Ottawa said, don't charge them with a crime, because if they get charged with a crime, they'll have a court case. And what's the judge going to say? They just want to buy a bottle of gin. The judge might sympathize with them. So I said, if their case gets thrown out, maybe Japanese Canadians can't be interned anymore, because it'll be a test case, right? So by all means, do not charge them with a crime. Don't even get any publicity. But what are we going to do with them then? Just put them back in, blah, 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 just quiet them down. What are we going to do with this bottle of gin? Back and forth. It goes back and forth. We don't know what to do with it. If we destroy it, then it's evidence. We're destroying evidence and stuff like that.